The sun shone brightly through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Church, casting colorful patterns on the polished wooden floor. The air inside was filled with the scent of fresh flowers, carefully arranged along the pews. Soft music played in the background as guests whispered among themselves, eagerly waiting for the ceremony to begin. It was a special day, a day of love, joy, and celebration. James stood near the altar, adjusting his tie nervously. He was a tall, well-dressed man in his early 30s, with sharp features and a confident smile. He had been waiting for this moment for months, and now, in just a few minutes, he would finally be married to the love of his life, Emily. He turned to his best man, David, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Relax, James," David whispered with a grin. "You've got this." James let out a small chuckle and took a deep breath. He scanned the crowd, seeing familiar faces, family members, close friends, and colleagues, all gathered to witness this special occasion. His mother sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, already overwhelmed with emotions. His father sat beside her, looking proud and dignified. Everything was perfect, just as James had imagined. Then, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. The soft music changed to a beautiful wedding tune, and all heads turned toward the entrance. The large wooden doors at the back of the church slowly opened, and there she was, Emily. She stood there in her white wedding gown, looking like a vision of elegance and grace. Her dress had delicate lace details, and the veil covered her face, adding to her beauty. A soft hush fell over the crowd as she took her first step forward. Her father, a dignified man with gray hair, held her arm and led her down the aisle. His expression was filled with pride and emotion as he walked his only daughter toward the man she was about to marry. James felt his heart skip a beat. He had always known Emily was beautiful, but today she looked even more radiant. As she walked toward him, he couldn't help but smile. This was the happiest day of his life. But as she got closer, something felt different. Emily's hands trembled slightly, and her steps were hesitant. Her eyes, partially visible through the thin veil, darted around the room as if she were searching for someone. James frowned slightly but dismissed it as wedding day nerves. After all, it was normal for a bride to feel emotional on her big day. Father Michael, the priest officiating the ceremony, watched Emily closely. He had conducted countless weddings in his life, and he knew the difference between excitement and unease. Something about Emily's body language caught his attention. She wasn't just nervous, she looked worried. A small flicker of concern passed through Father Michael's mind, but he pushed it aside. The ceremony was about to begin, and soon Emily and James would be husband and wife. However, deep inside, a strange feeling lingered, one he couldn't quite explain. The church was silent except for the soft music playing in the background. All eyes were on the beautiful bride as she walked down the aisle, her white dress flowing gracefully with each step. James watched her with a loving smile, his heart pounding with excitement. He had dreamed of this moment for so long, and now it was finally happening. Emily reached the altar and stood beside James. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Up close, her hands trembled slightly, and her breathing seemed uneven. James reached out to hold her hand, but she hesitated before taking it. He noticed her fingers were ice cold, despite the warmth inside the church. A small crease formed on his forehead, but he told himself it was just pre-wedding nerves. Father Michael cleared his throat and smiled at the couple. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of James and Emily in holy matrimony," he began in a calm and gentle voice. He had performed many weddings in his lifetime, but something about this one felt different. As he spoke, he glanced at Emily. There was a certain tension in her shoulders, a stiffness in the way she stood. Her eyes kept shifting toward the entrance of the church, almost as if she was expecting someone to walk in. Father Michael's years of experience told him that something was not right. A bride was supposed to be glowing with happiness, but Emily looked uneasy. James, still holding Emily's hand, gently squeezed it. "Are you okay?" he whispered softly so that only she could hear. Emily blinked and quickly nodded. "Yes, I'm fine," she replied, but her voice was barely above a whisper. Father Michael continued with the ceremony, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He watched as Emily took slow, deep breaths, as if trying to calm herself. Every now and then, her gaze flickered toward the entrance again. The guests, unaware of the silent tension, smiled happily as they listened to the priest's words. Some of them wiped away tears of joy, believing they were witnessing a beautiful moment of love. But Father Michael's sharp eyes caught the slight quiver in Emily's lips, the way she swallowed hard before answering even the simplest questions. Then, as he was about to proceed with the vows, Emily shifted her weight from one foot to another, her fingers tightening around the bouquet she held. Her knuckles turned white from the pressure. The priest hesitated. A strange feeling settled in his chest. He had seen many emotions in brides before: nervous excitement, joyful tears, even overwhelming happiness. But Emily's expression was different. It wasn't just nerves, it was fear. Father Michael took a slow breath, deciding to trust his instincts. Something was not right, and he needed to find out what it was before it was too late. The church was filled with warmth, the golden sunlight filtering through the tall stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the walls. The guests sat in eager silence, waiting for the moment when James and Emily would exchange their vows. It was supposed to be a perfect wedding, a day of love and happiness, but something didn't feel right. Father Michael stood before the couple, holding the holy book in his hands. He was about to continue with the vows when his eyes once again fell on Emily. Her hands were trembling slightly as she clutched her bouquet, her knuckles turning pale. Her breathing seemed unsteady, and every few seconds she glanced toward the entrance of the church, as if she were expecting someone to walk in. The priest hesitated. Weddings were always emotional, but this was different. There was something in Emily's eyes, something that told him she was not just nervous. She was afraid. James, standing beside her, seemed unaware of her distress. He looked at her with love, his face full of excitement. He gently reached for her hand again, squeezing it softly, as if trying to reassure her. Emily gave him a weak smile, but Father Michael noticed how forced it looked. A deep silence settled over the church as Father Michael took a step closer to Emily. He cleared his throat and spoke in a kind but firm voice. "Emily, my child," he said softly, "are you sure you want to continue with this ceremony?" The room seemed to freeze. The guests exchanged confused glances, whispering among themselves. James frowned slightly, looking at the priest with confusion. "Of course she does," he said with a small chuckle, as if trying to lighten the mood. But Emily didn't answer immediately. She stared at Father Michael, her lips slightly parted, her eyes wide with emotion. It was as if she wanted to speak, but something was holding her back. The priest felt his heart tighten. He had seen many weddings, and he had learned to trust his instincts. Right now, everything inside him was telling him that something was wrong. He turned to Emily again, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "If there is anything you wish to say, my dear, know that this is a safe place," he said gently. "You are not alone." Emily swallowed hard. Her grip on the bouquet tightened even more. Her chest rose and fell as she took deep, shaky breaths. The entire church waited, the air thick with tension. Then, at that very moment, something happened that made everyone's breath catch. Emily opened her mouth as if to say something. But before she could, the large wooden doors at the entrance of the church suddenly burst open with a loud creak. Every head in the room turned toward the door. A man stood there, panting, his face filled with urgency. The room fell into complete silence. And then, in a voice full of desperation, the man spoke. "This wedding cannot happen." A loud gasp echoed through the church as all eyes turned toward the entrance. The man standing there looked out of breath, as if he had run a great distance to get here. His dark hair was messy, his shirt slightly wrinkled, and his face was filled with urgency. The guests whispered among themselves, trying to understand what was happening. Who was this man? Why had he barged into the wedding like this? Emily's bouquet slipped from her trembling hands and fell to the floor with a soft thud. Her eyes widened in shock, her lips slightly parted, but no words came out. She looked frozen, as if she had seen a ghost. James, standing beside her, clenched his fists. His jaw tightened as he stared at the unexpected guest. His once calm expression now showed signs of frustration. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "And why are you interrupting our wedding?" The man took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Then, in a voice filled with emotion, he looked directly at Emily and said, "Emily, it's me. It's Daniel." A wave of confusion spread through the crowd. People turned to each other, whispering, trying to recall the name. Then suddenly, a few gasps of recognition filled the room. Father Michael's eyes widened in realization. He had heard about Daniel before. He was Emily's older brother, the brother who had been missing for years. Emily took a shaky step forward, tears welling up in her eyes. "Daniel," she whispered, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "But you were—" Her voice broke, unable to finish the sentence. Daniel nodded, his own eyes glistening. "I know what you thought. I know what everyone believed," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But I'm alive, Emily, and I had to come back before it was too late." The entire church fell into stunned silence. Some guests had tears in their eyes, moved by the emotional reunion, while others sat in shock, struggling to process what was happening. James, however, did not look moved. His face had lost its color, and his body was tense. He took a step toward Emily, gently grabbing her arm. "Emily, let's not do this here," he said in a low voice, his tone forced and controlled. "This is our wedding. We can talk later." But Emily wasn't listening. Her teary eyes remained locked on her brother. She took another shaky step forward, pulling away from James's grip. How is this possible?" she asked. Daniel took a deep breath, looking around at the stunned crowd before turning back to Emily. His next words sent a chill through the entire room. "I came to stop this wedding because you don't know the truth," he said firmly. "You can't marry him, Emily. He's not who you think he is." A hushed silence filled the church. The weight of his words hung in the air, making everyone hold their breath. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She turned to look at James, but for the first time, she saw something different in his eyes, something she had never noticed before. And in that moment, she realized that everything she believed about the man she was about to marry was about to change forever. The church was completely silent. No one moved. No one even breathed too loudly. The weight of Daniel's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Emily stood frozen, her hands trembling at her sides. Her mind struggled to process what was happening. Her brother, her dear brother Daniel, whom she had believed was gone forever, was standing right in front of her. It felt like a miracle, yet at the same time, it felt like a nightmare. James's face had lost all its color. His jaw tightened, and his grip on Emily's hand became firmer, almost possessive. "What are you talking about?" he asked through gritted teeth. His voice was low, but there was something in his tone that made Father Michael uneasy. Daniel took a step forward, his eyes locked on James. "Emily," he said, his voice firm but filled with emotion. "I know you're confused, but you have to listen to me. You cannot marry this man." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She turned to James, searching his face for reassurance, for comfort, but for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that she couldn't ignore. It wasn't love. It wasn't kindness. It was fear. "Daniel, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You've been gone for years. Where have you been? Why are you saying this now on my wedding day?" Daniel swallowed hard, glancing at the priest and then at the guests, who were all watching with wide eyes. "I wanted to come back sooner," he admitted, "but I couldn't, and I was afraid that if I didn't make it today, it would be too late." James let out a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. "This is ridiculous," he said, shaking his head. He turned to Emily, trying to regain control of the situation. "Emily, don't listen to him. He left years ago. He's been gone so long, and now he just shows up out of nowhere to ruin our wedding. This is some kind of mistake." But Daniel wasn't backing down. "No," he said firmly. "The mistake is you pretending to be someone you're not." Emily took a step back, shaking her head. I don't understand," she whispered. Her hands felt cold. Her legs felt weak. Daniel's eyes softened as he looked at her. "I know this is hard, but you need to hear the truth," he said. He turned back to James, his expression darkening. "You know exactly why I've been gone, don't you?" James's eyes flickered, just for a second. But it was enough. That single moment of hesitation sent a shiver down Emily's spine. "I have proof," Daniel continued. "Proof that James has been lying to you all along. Proof that he's not the man you think he is." A murmur spread through the crowd. People shifted in their seats, whispering to one another. The atmosphere had completely changed. Emily felt as though the walls were closing in around her. She turned to James, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me it's not true," she pleaded. "Tell me he's lying." James clenched his fists, his jaw tightening even more. But he didn't say a word. And in that silence, Emily knew. Everything was about to change. The church felt colder now, despite the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. The guests sat frozen in their seats, their eyes darting between James, Emily, and Daniel. The air was thick with tension, so heavy that it was almost suffocating. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her wedding dress as she waited for James to speak, to say something that would make everything okay. But he didn't. He just stood there, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists at his sides. Daniel took a deep breath and looked straight at Emily. His voice was steady, but she could hear the pain behind it. "Emily, I know you love him," he said. "I know you think you know him, but you don't. He has been lying to you all along." Emily shook her head, her mind racing. "That's not possible," she whispered. "James has always been good to me. He's kind. He loves me." James finally spoke, his voice tight. "Of course I love you, Emily." He turned to Daniel, his eyes dark with anger. "And I won't let you ruin this day for us." Daniel ignored him and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small envelope, slightly crumpled, and held it up. "I have proof," he said, his voice unwavering. The crowd gasped again. Emily's hands trembled as she stared at the envelope. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. James's face darkened. He took a step forward, his voice sharp. "Don't do this, Daniel." But Daniel didn't stop. He turned to Father Michael. "Please," he said, "you are a man of faith, a man of truth. Let Emily see what's inside this envelope before she makes the biggest mistake of her life." The priest hesitated, then nodded slowly. "The truth must always come to light," he said gently. Daniel stepped forward and placed the envelope in Emily's shaking hands. She stared at it, feeling as if the entire world had stopped moving. With a deep breath, she carefully opened it. Inside were several papers. Her eyes moved over the words, but her mind refused to believe what she was seeing. Her breath hitched and her knees weakened. She felt as if the ground beneath her was vanishing. "No, this can't be true," she whispered, her voice breaking. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked up at James. For the first time, she saw the truth in his face. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't confused. He was caught. The room was silent as everyone watched, waiting for her reaction. Emily turned back to Daniel, her lips trembling. How did you find this?" she asked, barely able to get the words out. Daniel's eyes filled with sorrow. Because I've spent the last few years searching for the truth, he said softly, and I couldn't let you marry a man who has been hiding so much from you. Emily's hands tightened around the papers. Her heart was breaking, but she knew one thing for sure: this wedding could not continue. She looked at James one last time. "Tell me the truth," she said, her voice firmer now. "No more lies." James's lips parted, but no words came out. His silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. And in that moment, Emily knew her entire future had just changed. The church felt colder now, despite the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. The guests sat frozen in their seats, their eyes darting between James, Emily, and Daniel. The air was thick with tension, so heavy that it was almost suffocating. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her wedding dress as she waited for James to speak, to say something that would make everything okay. But he didn't. He just stood there, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists at his sides. Daniel took a deep breath and looked straight at Emily. His voice was steady, but she could hear the pain behind it. "Emily, I know you love him," he said. "I know you think you know him, but you don't. He has been lying to you all along." Emily shook her head, her mind racing. "That's not possible," she whispered. "James has always been good to me. He's kind. He loves me." James finally spoke, his voice tight. "Of course I love you, Emily." He turned to Daniel, his eyes dark with anger. "And I won't let you ruin this day for us." Daniel ignored him and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small envelope, slightly crumpled, and held it up. "I have proof," he said, his voice unwavering. The crowd gasped again. Emily's hands trembled as she stared at the envelope. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. James's face darkened. He took a step forward, his voice sharp. "Don't do this, Daniel." But Daniel didn't stop. He turned to Father Michael. "Please," he said, "you are a man of faith, a man of truth. Let Emily see what's inside this envelope before she makes the biggest mistake of her life." The priest hesitated, then nodded slowly. "The truth must always come to light," he said gently. Daniel stepped forward and placed the envelope in Emily's shaking hands. She stared at it, feeling as if the entire world had stopped moving. With a deep breath, she carefully opened it. Inside were several papers. Her eyes moved over the words, but her mind refused to believe what she was seeing. Her breath hitched, and her knees weakened. She felt as if the ground beneath her was vanishing. "No, this can't be true," she whispered, her voice breaking. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked up at James. For the first time, she saw the truth in his face. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't confused. He was caught. The room was silent as everyone watched, waiting for her reaction. Emily turned back to Daniel, her lips trembling. How did you find this?" she asked, barely able to get the words out. Daniel's eyes filled with sorrow. "Because I've spent the last few years searching for the truth," he said softly, "and I couldn't let you marry a man who has been hiding so much from you." Emily's hands tightened around the papers. Her heart was breaking, but she knew one thing for sure: this wedding could not continue. She looked at James one last time. "Tell me the truth," she said, her voice firmer now. "No more lies." James's lips parted, but no words came out. His silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. And in that moment, Emily knew her entire future had just changed. The moment Emily spoke those words, "This wedding is over," a heavy silence filled the church. The guests, who had been holding their breath, now stared in shock. Some exchanged whispers, while others simply sat frozen, unable to believe what had just happened. James's face turned pale. His hands clenched at his sides, and for a moment, he looked as if he might protest. But he didn't. Instead, he let out a slow breath, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He knew there was nothing left to say. Emily felt her heart pounding in her chest, but for the first time in a long time, she felt something else too: relief. The weight she had been carrying, the doubts she had ignored, the uneasy feeling she had pushed away, all of it was finally gone. She had made the right decision. Father Michael, who had been watching everything unfold with quiet understanding, gave her a gentle nod. "You have shown great courage today, my child," he said softly. "It is always better to walk away from a lie than to live in its shadow." Emily turned to Daniel, her eyes shining with emotion. He had come back just in time, risking everything to tell her the truth. She didn't know how to thank him. Instead of speaking, she stepped forward and threw her arms around him, hugging him tightly. Daniel hugged her back, his voice thick with emotion. "I promised Mom and Dad I'd always protect you," he whispered. "I wasn't going to break that promise." Tears filled Emily's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of love, of relief. She pulled back and looked at him, shaking her head in disbelief. "I thought I lost you forever," she said softly. Daniel smiled. "I'm here now," he said, "and I'm not going anywhere." The guests in the church slowly began to stand, their whispers turning into quiet murmurs of support. Some of them nodded in approval, while others simply looked relieved that Emily had made the right choice. James, however, stood still, his expression unreadable. Finally, after a long silence, he turned to Emily. "I never meant to hurt you," he said, his voice low. Emily met his gaze, searching for any signs of regret. Maybe, in his own way, he had loved her. But love without truth wasn't real love, and she deserved better. She took a deep breath and nodded. "I hope you find the truth within yourself someday," she said gently. "But I can't be a part of it." With that, she turned away from him. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even sad. She was free. As she walked down the aisle, no longer a bride but a woman who had reclaimed her future, she felt lighter. Daniel walked beside her, his presence a reminder that she wasn't alone. The church doors opened, and as she stepped outside, the warm sunlight hit her face. It was as if the universe itself was telling her she had done the right thing. This wasn't the wedding day she had imagined, but it was the beginning of something even better, a new chapter, filled with truth, love, and the promise of a brighter future.